Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, and the other relates to the government of Jamaica's progress towards the Vision 2030 National Development Plan outcome number 10, which is diversification of energy supply, and Sustainable Development Goal number 7, which is affordable and clean energy. So those are the two main substantive items that we have. But before we get into that, we have the minutes of our meeting of June the 18th before us, and I would ask members if we could go through those quickly and approve them with subject to any required changes. So page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5. I have one query on page 5, Madam Clerk, and it's the second paragraph, I suppose it is, from the top, where it makes reference, it reads, Member Phillips queried whether outside of the SCT that was owed, there are any other amounts owed by the JUTC for fuel taken. Ms. Evans said that she did not have that information because the SCT obligation was between PETCOM and JUTC. I'm not sure that reference to SCT obligation is correct there, because the query was about other amounts owed by JUTC for fuel. We'd already addressed SCT in the previous paragraph, and I think that the SCT obligation is owed to Petrojam on behalf of the government. So I suspect, rather than say STT obligation, we say because the other obligations were between PETCOM and JUTC. Yeah, but the other obligations were. Page 6, page 7, page 8, page 9. On page 9, at the very top, I think the first sentence says the chairman asked about the target number of students and the budget proposed for the 2019. I don't think we need the word iteration program. We can just take this 2019 program. There were previous references to iterations of the program, but it's the 2019 program we're referring to there. And further down the page, in the paragraph, the second paragraph that says member done, member done made reference. In the fourth line, it says Mr. Richardson said. I think it should say said.
Oh, the
I is missing, yeah. Page 10, page 11, page 12. With that, would anyone care to move for the adoption of the minutes subject to those three corrections? Moved by Member Clark, seconded by Member Phillips. Thank you, gentlemen. Any matters arising from the minutes? Just to say that we have a draft report which was circulated, and members, it was circulated among many other attachments to a meeting, to an email dealing with today's meeting. So unless you checked your emails carefully, you would not notice that the report was there. But it is, yes. So members can have a look at that. We're not proposing to deal with that today, because it only came on Friday, I think. But it is there, and members will need to go through it. Any other matters arising from the minutes? There being no other matters arising from the minutes, we can get into the substantive matters at hand. Now, in order to know how best to proceed, Madam Clerk, please advise me. We have two matters. One is on the implementation or Jamaica's preparedness for the implementation of Sustainable Development Goals, and the other is to do with the report on progress towards diversification of energy supply and affordable and clean energy. In terms of who is here and able to address these matters, I know we have P.S. Palmer from the ministry responsible for energy. We have the PIOJ Director General. You please guide me as to which one you think we should deal with first.
AG, we'll have to guide AG, I defer to AG.
On the question, well, the AG would only be able to tell us as to who is here, who was invited. It's not the AG who invited people to come in.
No, in terms of the matters, well, the MC.
We have two prompts. We have a prompt for each matter from the AG.
But they're interlinked.
Yeah.
The two matters. They're not okay.
No.
That was my impression.
No, they're separate, although they both.
Do number two then.
I'm just saying in terms of persons present, are we which one are we best able to proceed with, given who has attended so far? And you're saying the second one?
Well, I'm sure Dr. Henry can deal with this on behalf of the FS.
Okay.
So you can proceed.
But you're expecting the cabinet secretary, right? To deal with that one,
as well.
and he hasn't come yet.
So Ms. Palmer is here for
Ms.
number
Palmer is here for number two. Dr. Henry, given that you said the cabinet secretary may attend, but is not here yet.
So it's his intention to come.
Yeah.
Just running late.
Yes.
If it's on the SDG matters we can speak to.
Yes.
Or do our best to try to respond to as we do.
All right.
Just say clearly, so the cap said he was awarded the title.
Yes.
At the PS board this morning, so I left him there.
Yes.
And as you heard, the FS not able to come in. We were out of control to start.
Right. I'm just trying to identify whether it makes sense to proceed with the SDG report first or the energy report first.
I went to the SDG first.
Okay. Very well. All right. So, members, we have received various materials by email and a prompt prepared by the Auditor General's Department. And as is customary, I would propose to go through the prompt item by item, but inviting the Auditor General perhaps to just give us a little overview before we get into the nitty-gritty of it. So, Madam Auditor General, if you would be so kind as to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'm just going to bring you through the process, which is related to the process that the audit took to put this report in context. So to begin, the audit sought to support the government's preparedness for the implementation of the UN Sustainable Development Goals by identifying the progress made and the current challenges so that the government can take action to expedite its preparedness to achieve these goals by 2030, especially in light of the fact that we only have 12 years, well, at the time of writing this report, it was 12 years remaining to achieve those 2030 targets. Now, in approaching the audit, we developed 3 levels of questions. The first level being pretty straightforward. Is Jamaica prepared for the implementation of the 2030 agenda? On the second level, we had 2 questions. One, are there effective mechanisms to ensure preparedness for the implementation of the SDGs? And in this, we're referring to institutional planning, framework, resources, and awareness. The second question is, has the government established mechanisms to monitor the progress towards the implementation of SDGs in Jamaica? And in this regard, we were referring to monitoring, review, and follow-up and reporting. On the third level, we asked 5 questions. 1, has Jamaica established the necessary institutional framework to support the achievement of Agenda 2030, and the criteria being the GOJ should establish an institutional framework to support the implementation. The second question is the government identifying and allocating resources and capacities for the implementation of the SDGs in Jamaica? And the criteria is that the Ministry of Finance and Planning and Public Service should prioritize allocation of resources to implement the SDGs. Third, are there established mechanisms to raise stakeholder awareness and ownership of the SDGs and the Vision 2030 Jamaica? The criteria being PIOJ should establish various communication strategies to engage, inform different segments of the society as well as integrate the public. The fourth question, has the government identified all key performance indicators and baseline and set milestones for the implementation? The criteria being Statin should have guidelines for monitoring to facilitate the review of the progress of the SDG implementation. And the last is, are there effective mechanisms for reporting on the implementation of the SDGs? Of course, the criteria was the PIOJ, along with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, should have mechanisms and guidelines for reporting to the necessary stakeholders. As you would see reflected on your prompt, the audit revealed that Jamaica has made notable progress towards the implementation of the SDGs, particularly in establishing the institutional framework and building public awareness. However, there was need for a comprehensive long-term funding strategy for priority projects to implement the SDGs. The accountability framework requires greater clarity, while the monitoring and reporting mechanisms require greater coordination among key implementers. The prompt would outline our key concern at the time was the fact that though PIOJ, I believe, was proactive in actually managing the process, PIOJ at the time was not designated as the authority to have control of this process, and that created, I believe, some reticence among some other participating members in the collaboration process. Another area of concern was there was lack of visibility or demonstration by the Ministry of Finance of its involvement in the process. And I think until recently, the ministry had not identified someone to be represented on the committee that had been established by the PIOJ. And of course, there's the issue with Statin and the identifying all the indicators, which is really not unique to Jamaica. I hope that Statin will also be available here this morning to discuss. Okay, great. So I think that sets it into context, and I will now hand over to you, Mr. Chairman, and ask that they respond.
Thank you, AG. So members, we've heard the overview of what this is about. And of course, Jamaica has its Vision 2030 plan, which has been a bipartisan development plan of the country. And with the advent of the SDGs coming out of the UN system, I think the approach has been to basically treat our Vision 2030 plan as our primary plan for achieving the SDGs, because there's such a substantial overlap between them. That's my understanding, though it's not 100% coverage. And so the report has dealt with, as has been said, institutional arrangements for preparing Jamaica to achieve the SDG targets, and monitoring and reporting aspects of the whole process. So we have on page 3 of the prompt, where the key data is summarized, and it might be worth just reading those into the record. At the time of writing, now this would be as at September 2018, or that we're talking about here, not the date of the prompt itself, but the date of the report, correct? Well, yeah. So at that time, there was 91.3% alignment of Jamaica's national planning documents, which I assume is the Vision 2030 documents, to the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. So 91.3% alignment. And and maybe we could have some explanation as to the areas where there isn't alignment and how that will be addressed. Then, in that regard, 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals are embodied in Jamaica's National Development Plan, Vision 2030. Apparently 6 sources of funding are being pursued for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 234 global indicators which are applicable to Jamaica, and Statin currently monitors, when I say currently, as at the date of the report, which is September 2018, Statin was monitoring then 51% of Jamaica's applicable indicators, so roughly half were being monitored and the other half were not for one reason or another, and we will hear from Statin as to why the coverage is, at that time, was only roughly half of the indicators in terms of monitoring, and whether that is still the situation or whether it has changed. Issue 1 in the prompt, which is on page 4, deals with national ownership, integration of the 2030 agenda into the national context. The government of Jamaica, in collaboration with the UNDP, conducted an alignment exercise, the results of which showed that Jamaica's national planning documents combined indicated 105 of the 115 targets, 91.3%, as we said earlier, were fully or partially aligned to the SDGs. This confirmed that the SDGs were largely integrated into the national context. However, the targets related primarily to the natural environment reduced inequalities, and partnership for goals reflected low levels of alignment. So the low levels of alignment were in the areas of the targets for the natural environment, for reduced inequalities in the society, and in the area of partnership for goals. I hope I've read that properly, yes. Further alignment will be undertaken and reflected in subsequent planning documents, such as the medium-term socio-economic policy framework. Management's response to that, and this came from the PIOJ, and it was dated October 2nd, 2019. Please see draft document attached, alignment of the Vision 2030 Jamaica National Development Plan, medium-term socio-economic policy framework, MTF, 2018 to 2021, national strategies to the Sustainable Development Goals, indicators and targets, which outlines the main areas of alignment between the medium-term framework of 2018-2021 and the SDGs. And this document is a work in progress. And from the Auditor General's response to that, our review of PIOJ's alignment of the Vision 2030 plan and the medium-term framework, the MTF, for 2018 to 2021, to the Sustainable Development Goals, indicators and targets shown alignment to reduce inequalities, the natural environment, as well as partnership for goals. So by that, what I get from that is that, having looked at this documentation that was produced by the PIOJ subsequent to the report last year, you are satisfied that on these 3 areas there is alignment now: the natural inequalities, natural environment, and partnership for goals. Is that broadly correct?
That's my understanding, Mr. Chairman.
So Dr. Henry, perhaps you could just indicate for us this 91.3% alignment, which is a high number, given that we came up with the 2030 strategy ourselves, and the UN came up with its sustainable development goals through the UN system. So to have such a substantial area of alignment is a good thing.
Very good.
But it begs the question as to the other 8.7% where there isn't alignment with the goals. Now, am I correct in understanding that it is that 8.7% rather, is what was covered or not covered previously, but is now covered in relation to the natural environment and inequalities and partnership for goals? Is that the area that wasn't covered by the 91.3%? Yes, so that now is addressed. Yes, I see. All right. Thank you. Members, do you have any question on this aspect of things? Or can I move on to the second issue?
If I might, Mr. Chair, for the benefit of the committee,
yes.
Let me quickly just say who is here to benefit the committee. I have Ms. Rochelle White from the PIOJ, the Director General's Office, advisor. Ms. Pisha Bryan Lee is the head of Vision 2030, the Secretariat at the PIOJ. Mr. Travis Reed is the lead economist in the Vision 2030 Secretariat. We have Mrs. Latoya Clark, who is a program director and focal point for SDG implementation at the PIOJ. We have Ms. Delisha Delatibodere, Deputy Director General of the Statistical Institute of Jamaica. And we have Mr. Sean Gray and Ms. Colleen White, who are from the Cabinet Office. As you've outlined, our Vision 2030 Jamaica National Development Plan, our long-term plan, the first long-term plan for Jamaica, one of its kind, was enjoyed bipartisan support, strong consensus around the plan development itself. Took some years, a number of years to develop. We launched in about 2009, and we tend to measure progress of the plan in using the format and the mechanism of our medium-term socio-economic policy framework, what we refer to as the MTF. And those are three-year frameworks that seek to look at how Vision 2030 is doing in terms of implementation, ensuring alignment with our goals, program strategies of the ministries, departments, agencies, and tracking progress. And so we're looking at, in the 2018 to 2021 is our fourth such framework in terms of MTF. We had 2009 to 12, 12 to 15, 15 to 18, and now we're looking at 18 to 21. When this was being promulgated, our long-term development plan, as you know, we report to the country quarterly on updates and progress under the plan and how we are doing according to the goals and targets there. By pre-2015, you are looking at the Millennium Development Goals, you recall the MDGs. And at 2015, they did a refresh, if you would, an assessment of the global economy and development landscape of the global economy, and began to look now at what we call the post-2015 agenda, or the 2030 development agenda, which is now what we call the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Jamaica was, because of, we think, the performance and probably record of the country, we were very much a part of that process at the UN that developed the SDGs. And so a lot of the Vision 2030 framework would already inform, if you will, the SDG framework itself. And so as we began to implement the post-2015 agenda, UN team, what we call a MAPS mission, a mainstream accelerating and program support or policy support mission, MAPS, came to look at the alignment between the SDG agenda and Jamaica's Vision 2030. And that's where that 91% alignment was derived in terms of determined. And at the time, they said it was probably the highest in the world that they had seen in terms of the level of alignment between the SDG agenda and Vision 2030, which means that if we were to implement Vision 2030, come 2030, having implemented our own long-term development plan, we would have achieved the SDGs to over 91% achievement. And I think now I'm going to ask some of the team now to weigh in on some of the specifics, but there's a robust mechanism the Cabinet Office doing in terms of the results-based and output-based framework, outcome monitoring. A lot of, I think, leaning forward on the matter of treating with development results and trying to move the country forward. We have a core group that looks at SDG implementation that's comprised of the PIOJ, Statin, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we prepared for Jamaica's what we call a voluntary national report. What we call our VNR.
Sure. Why don't you come and sit beside that?
There's a reluctance to sit beside me, I don't know why.
Welcome.
And I can move over one if you need.
Thank you for coming down. Good to see you.
Yes.
Welcome to the Cabinet Secretary. We've just started. We're on the first item in the prompt, and Dr. Henry is giving a kind of general overview of the whole process.
And so, thank you. So the core group for SDG implementation, again, PIOJ, Statin, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs led a wider team to develop what we call a voluntary national report, a VNR, which all countries are asked to present at the UN, the headquarters of the United Nations. We presented last year our VNR, very collaborative effort, a very well-received presentation because of the progress so far. And we are careful to say that while we can highlight tremendous progress, obviously in the field and the landscape of development, there's always much more to be done. But it's fair to say, as peer review and international assessments would say, we've done quite in terms of some of the progress there. But let me allow the team, who are the real experts, to speak to. Let's speak to what it means, 91% alignment, maybe, Pisha, and what it means going forward, those areas and the difficulties. I'm going to ask Lisha to speak on the Statin. Statin has responsibility for all the data monitoring for that and the challenges you may have, the successes. If you could speak to that, and then maybe some specific questions from the committee, please.
Good morning. In 2016, we were determined to be 91% aligned to the SDGs, and the planning document spoke to Vision 2030 Jamaica, the medium-term socioeconomic policy framework at the time that was in place, and also the major sectoral policies and strategies that are aligned to Vision 2030 Jamaica. So those comprise the documents that were assessed. Since then, we have worked to address the gaps. And so when we were developing MTF 2018 to 2021, we gave focus to addressing the areas of partnership, environment, and inequalities while maintaining those areas that we already had strong alignment. So in the areas of the environment, for example, we gave greater focus to the blue and green economy, and you can see that there. We also gave greater focus to ensuring that the partnership arrangements and issues related, for example, even government effectiveness, were given greater prominence. And in the areas of inequality, whilst we did give focus to, for example, gender equality and other areas in prior MTFs, we realized that that could have been clearer so that that alignment was more evident. Also to note, when we did our previous MTF, which was MTF 2015 to 2018, the same month that the SDGs were approved, the SDGs were approved on September 25, 2015, we also presented, the SDGs were approved on September 25. We also presented the MTF to Cabinet in September 2015. So both were basically approved at the same time, which means that all we could do at that time was show the alignment between our national outcome, our 15 national outcomes, and the SDGs themselves. For this MTF 2018 to 2021, we're able to delve deeper and to show the alignment between our strategies and the targets. And I think that also made it easier to see alignment that maybe previously, in the previous assessment, would not have been as obvious. So in that regard, that is how we address the alignment. The document that we sent to the Auditor General was a pullout from the MTF. Because whilst we did do alignment for the MTF, as we go along, we see areas where we could have highlighted greater, and so we pulled out a working document that made it very easy for you to just see the alignment instead of going through that very thick document, the MTF.
Thank you. Could you just repeat your name for the Hansard minute taker?
My name is Pisha Branley.
Thank you. Right. Okay. Please proceed. And just repeat your name for the benefit of the hand.
Lisha Delati-Badir. Lisha Delati-Badir. So in the report, it stated that there was 51% of the indicators that Statin wasn't being produced by Jamaica. The production of indicators is a collaborative effort that spans a number of government agencies, ministries, and departments. Of that 51%, it should be noted that 4.1% were not applicable to Jamaica. So there are some indicators that refer specifically to landlocked countries that would not apply to us, or to the developed world in terms of their aid towards the developing countries that again would not have been applicable to us. Additionally, about half of the indicators that we weren't producing were classified as Tier 3 indicators. And what this meant was that at that point in time, there was no international consensus on the methodology to develop, to measure these indicators. So what the 2030 agenda has done is that it has put in sharp focus the need for more data. However, the methodological development has not kept apace with the demand for the data. So what we have seen in the years since the inception of the SDGs is that there's been a lot of methodological work across the globe, globally, of which Statin has been a part of, in terms of arriving at a consensus to ensure that when we're measuring something and we're reporting on it, it is consistent across countries. Because one of the key metrics for Statin is that we publish indicators that are internationally comparable, so that we can adequately assess where we are relative to our other partners in the world. Since the report was done, however, we can report that we have done a number of activities that will improve the amount of indicators that we're able to report on in the next SDG report, indicators report, which is scheduled for the end of this fiscal year. So we had a project with UN Water on Goal 6 to develop indicators, and that included a number of players locally, including the National Water Commission, the Water Resources Authority, NEPA. It was a collaborative effort to try and improve the availability of indicators on Goal 6. Additionally, at the global level, there has been some development with regards to big data. For example, NASA has released some satellite imagery that would help us to report better on a number of indicators, for example, change in land use, efficiency over time. Additionally, there has been other big data projects with Google, with other players in the big data space in terms of making available information so that we can better report on certain of these environmental indicators, because the report would have shown that one of our weakest areas was environmental statistics. Additionally, since the report, we have done a number of surveys. So we did the Women's Health Survey, which has given us a number of SDG indicators, and also the Child Labor Survey.
Could you just repeat those two surveys? What were they?
The Women's Health Survey, and that one gave us data on, for example, women who had been subject to domestic violence within the home. Additionally, the Child Labor Survey, the Youth Activity Survey, which gave us indicators on child labor. So those two have been done. So we are now able to report on indicators coming out of those two surveys. We also, in partnership with the National Family Planning Board and UNICEF, are scheduled to be doing a reproductive health survey, which has been outstanding for quite a number of years due to lack of funding. And this brings me to a significant point with regards to Jamaica's ability to measure and produce indicators. The cost of surveys are high, and finding funding to do these surveys is quite difficult. Specifically, in the past, I remember years ago when I was in charge of special projects, we would be able to access donor funding easily in order to do surveys. Our development partners were in a better financial position to provide us grant funding to conduct survey. We are now designated an upper middle income country, and as such our access to financing for survey and data production is much less than it used to be. So what that now has put in focus is that the government of Jamaica now has to fund these data collection activities. And of course, there's always the trade-off in terms of how do we allocate the very scarce resources and what is the best way to spend the resources that we have as a country. So that has been a challenge. There are also a number of the indicators that are only available from censuses, and as you know, we do a census every 10 years. So some of these indicators will only be produced when we do the next census in 2021. And also there is the challenge of the fact that a lot of the administrative data that we have is paper-based. And some of these indicators come from administrative data sources. So there's the need to modernize the public service, to digitize some of the information, to give us greater access to data. So these are some of the challenges that we have been facing, but we have been working with our partners through the development of the National Statistics System to try and improve the availability of data for decision making and to monitor our progress towards the goals.
Dr. Henry, you mentioned that 2009 was what sort of launch of the National Development Plan, and 2030 is the sort of target date for achieving the deliverables under the plan. So we're close to halfway through that process. Do we have a sense of how far along we are in terms of achieving the various targets and deliverables that are in our National Development Plan?
We do, Chairman. Thank you. Last check we had achieved progress. When we mention and let me pause to say we've been joined by Minister of Foreign Affairs since we started, as Ms. Denise Seeley from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who spoke about the core group comprising Statin, Foreign Affairs, and PIOJ. So we've been reporting progress periodically on Vision 2030, and of our 67 indicators, we had 63% progress. When we look, we use the stoplight indicator, red, green, yellow, red, yellow, green, stoplight. So we've made progress to some 67%, 64% of our 67 indicators that we capture had progress towards meeting the goal or had met. So we had some that we had met and some that we were progress towards meeting, so to some 64%. And then another 30, maybe 32%, we had no such progress since we established the baseline, no progress towards, some areas that we had made progress in, we may have regressed. And we always make the point that sustainable development takes place when we sustain the efforts. So some areas that you may have done well in over some years, you can have regressed. And then another very small percentage, as Ms. Delatibodier shared, we may not have captured, or you may see some no progress any at all. But let me allow Pisha to say again, just to elucidate some of those areas that we have in terms of specific indicators that we've done well. Some come to mind immediately, but Pisha, if you can just give an overview, or Travis, quickly, what are some of those areas we've made progress in, those that we have not?
Myself and Mr. Travis Reid would address this question. I'll start off by saying that our baseline is 2007, so our baseline year is 2007. And as our Director General just said, we improved in 64%. Within that 64%, some of our indicators met or exceeded their targets, and I think that was 32? 32% met or exceeded the targets, and another 32% improved above baseline, which means they improved above 2007 but failed to meet the target. Our targets are set for every 3 years, which means that our medium-term socioeconomic policy framework covers 3-year periods, 3-year fiscal year periods. So at the end of each 3-year fiscal period, that's where the target is set, going towards 2030. To date, we have achieved one 2030 target. We achieved a 2030 target in 2017, but that was in fact not a positive. We achieved our population growth rate in 2017. We became negative. It's rounded off to 0 in our ESSJ, but we reached negative population growth. That was not in line with the policy imperatives, with the plans, and so whilst we achieved that target, that was not a positive for us. So we now have to re-examine our policy approach to population management because of all the other implications associated with having that negative population. So that's the only one that met the target ahead of schedule.
So why was it a target if it's something we don't want to achieve?
Our population growth rate, we targeted 0 for 2030. We didn't target 0 for 2017. So we achieved ahead of time, which would not have been aligned to the other plans, which is linked to your target setting. So that in and of itself was a challenge. For those 32% that improved above baseline, within that we had some that were moving in the direction of the target, and we had some that were moving away from the target, which means they were still better than 2007. Some were consistently improving and some were slipping. So they didn't go back to 2007, but they were not as good as the year before. So we were seeing slippage in some indicators. And then for 32%, they were the same as 2007 or worse, which means that we basically were seeing no improvement, or we were worse than we were in 2007.
Of course, this report, as I understand it, is not measuring any of that.
No.
This report is focused on the compatibility or alignment between
Right.
our national development plan and the UN's program
Right.
for all countries, which are the
Right.
Sustainable Development Goals. So it's a much narrower focus that
Right.
we are really embarked on
Right.
than the much broader and perhaps more important issue as to how we're actually doing in achieving those goals that we've set ourselves. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, when we continue to report, we are reporting on the broader. So that 64% broken down to the 232s, achieving or above and towards, and those that have not. We report on that on a quarterly basis. On a periodic basis, we continue to, and as Ms. Branley has said, even the 3-year term that we continue to report on that. So that broader thing we continue to report on. The reporting question that you speak to is in a narrower focus of alignment with the UN SDGs, the post-2030, the post-2015 agenda. Just quickly on the issue of population, one of the difficulties, of course, is because countries are disparate, and you try to set a target that you think of zero population growth, but understanding that's a crude overall measure. The difficulty of trying to do global measures, just like GDP, when it's a GDP per capita, the difficulty is while countries like Jamaica are classified middle income and upper middle income in terms of GDP, and you think it's a basis for whether you can access certain types of financing in a global space, we are still vulnerable, even more vulnerable than other countries that have, right? Even much less. And so the challenge is you use a crude measure and you get into some difficulty. We can't access certain grant funding, but then we are in the hurricane belt like most of the Caribbean region, even though we are middle income. And so in the issue of population, some countries, Jamaica included, are facing this demographic transition where you're seeing an aging population and what it means, the policy implications and social implications for the country, while other countries are not, a number of the African states don't. And so for them, you're coming to zero. That may be good because it reduces a social burden, and so. But in other countries, it's not in terms of the ability to replace itself in terms of the population. So again, these are crude measures, which the difficulty of a UN system would be: how do you set a measure that begins to now inform and speak to a global market?
And migration and the impact that has on our population.
Correct.
And how we measure our population, because we have such a substantial diaspora.
Correct.
I mean, our diaspora, persons who live abroad, Jamaicans abroad, are not treated as part of our population.
Correct.
For this purpose. Yeah.
Right. And so because of migration and death, the replacement rate and the reproduction, the birth rate, death and the birth rate, we are not replacing the population as fast as we should.
I see. And just before, remember, Phil, just one other question. The quarterly reporting that you do on progress towards the National Development Plan's goals, what form does that reporting take place? How do you do it?
We normally, when we report on quarterly for PIOJ, the economic performance, and we include different measures, different aspects of our Vision 2030. So we may speak to social impact, we may speak to climate because of the importance of where we are in terms of climate building resilience. So media present, and we normally present to media stakeholders. It's available on our website following, right, in terms of disseminating the information.
Part of an overall report on the economy and so on.
Correct.
Rather than being exclusively a
Standalone.
report on how we're doing in achieving these things item by item. It's not
Correct.
in that
So
format.
that's right. Sometimes we may weigh in more heavily, so we've taken quite a bit of time sometimes speaking to the social aspects of the report, but generally we report to cabinet. Peter will say, we always do in a fulsome way. Please.
We do present to Cabinet a report on the development results on the Vision 2030 Jamaica that is specific to Vision 2030 Jamaica. We're currently producing an annual report for the last fiscal year that will have those, will speak to the indicators, but will also speak to other areas related to national outcomes and processes as well. So we're currently working on that report. But periodically we do produce and continuously update the indicator framework, the data in the indicator frameworks. At any point in time, we can state to our stakeholders, based on the latest available data, this is where we are in relation to our targets.
So the report to Cabinet is a Cabinet document and is therefore secret. Yeah, is it made available generally to?
Yes.
Is it published generally?
We do. Our reports are also made available publicly.
Thank you. So, Member Phillips, you had something you wanted?
Just, which is it the same committee that oversees our own Vision 2030, or is there a particular committee that oversees our achievements, or just similar to the SDGs? Is there one?
That's the oversight committee for the SDG implementation specifically. And that's what's governed, if you will, by the core, what we call a comprise a core group, PIOJ, Statin, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and multi-stakeholder.
No, I understand that for the SDG.
Yes.
I'm talking about
For
Jamaica's Vision
2030.
National 2030 plan.
So yes.
Is there a committee such as the one for the SDG?
We do have a similar committee, and then we have what we call thematic working groups, where we can facilitate dialogue and interaction among broad stakeholders according to certain aspects of the National Development Plan. So again, quickly, just the Vision 2030, some of the thematic groups, some of the areas.
The main mechanism for monitoring and evaluation in terms of the institutional mechanism are called thematic working groups. Currently we have 14 established, but I think 9 or 10 are operational, in that some have become dormant for varying reasons. But I think 10 of the 14 are actually operational, which means that we do have meetings. What these thematic working groups represent is that the stakeholders are part of the monitoring process and part of the medium-term prioritization that leads to the development of each MTF, and they're also included in the reporting, so that when we produce reports, they review the reports, they inform how we address M&E as well, and also that they are continuously identifying gaps, and sometimes our thematic working groups also work to address gaps. So sometimes you see policy coming out of thematic working groups because the stakeholders, a number of stakeholders are there at the table, they use the mechanism to work together. So it also serves as well. We can't pull you from here, but because we're all at the table, we work to address what we think are key gaps to not achieving our 2030 goals.
Right. And what are some of the reasons why they are not functioning?
I think currently national security is one that is not functioning. Justice is one. Energy is one as well, and the other, infrastructure.
So national security, justice, energy, and infrastructure. Okay. All right.
But just to note that some of these sectors have other structures, and part of what they've communicated to us is there is meeting fatigue. And so, yes, sometimes, so what they've said to us is that they bring stakeholders for varying reasons, and then to bring them again for a thematic working group. So we are in discussions with some ministries about how we can better align what is happening. So we are in some of those discussions.
So meeting fatigue or not, then how is it then that we gather the data, we know that there is alignment with our own? Because let me tell you why. Because I said I prefer to dance a yard before I go abroad. Yeah? And we set ourselves these goals. And even though the baseline, you says 2007, I can tell you, I am one, every time that I pick up a document of 2030 or I hear it spoken about, I always said to myself, are we really serious about this? And as a parliamentarian, I even question if we are serious about this in 2030. The 2007, I know we have to have a baseline, but if we are not even near some of those baselines, which 2007 is years gone by, and we have not yet reached to some of those. You said it's what, 60 odd percent?
64.
30 odd percent?
32.
64.
64, but and we are going.
32 is.
We have made some progress, but that don't mean that we have reached where we want to. And we're aiming for 2030. So it's a moving target.
Roughly a third.
Roughly
we
a
haven't
third.
really made any progress, so that's a big concern.
But there are reasons for that. I don't think there are identified reasons for that. And there are a number of, and a lot of them, quite a bit of them can be addressed. Some are, I think some of them we are in the process of seeking to address some of the processes that are hindering progress. However, for some areas that are not doing very well in terms of we may still be at baseline or below, some of those areas were impacted, I think, when we experienced the global economic crisis, and we are recovering in some of those areas, just that the recovery has not still taken us.
Well, just like in this report with the SDGs, where our budgeting ought to be aligned to ensuring that we achieve some of these goals, then are we doing the same for our own Vision 2030?
Yeah.
You know, and I want to hear from the AG.
The point of the alignment, the 91.3% alignment, which based on the latest MTF, some of the residual unaligned items are now aligned, apparently. So really, our National Vision 2030 and the SDGs should really be completely or very substantially aligned. So if we're pursuing one, we're pursuing the other. Yeah.
The achievement for the SDGs compared to our Vision 2030, meaning in even the baseline of not even reaching the baseline, which is 2007. So there seems to me...
Yes.
That impacts. If they're aligned, then that must impact both.
Yes.
Yeah.
If I can add...
Auditor General had wanted to say something, sure. Yes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think I should have prefaced my introduction by setting out the reason that led to this audit. The audit is actually an audit that was managed by the Intersci Development Initiative. So 40 countries participated, and Jamaica being one of the 40. It was done in conjunction with the assistance of the United Nations, and it served two purposes. One, to assess the country's progress in implementing the necessary mechanism for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, but it was also a capacity building exercise to train the auditors who participated, to empower auditors to actually undertake this kind of review. So that's what led to this review. Having said that, on page 3 of the report, and it appears that the members do not have the full report, which would provide, the prompt really does not do any justice to the report. So it's really best for you to have a look at the full report. But on page 3 of the report, it sets out the 4 goals under the National Development Plan and shows the alignment of the 17 SDGs, well, more 16 based on what the 17th is. Prior to this report, the department undertook one cross-cutting performance audit looking at a goal under the National Development Plan, which is the next report that we are about to discuss. So that was the first one that we undertook. So that was a cross-cutting report looking at all the agencies involved. In the same way, we examined that for this report. Nonetheless, the performance audit reports, one of the key criteria is the agency's contribution to the National Development Plan and the activity that we are reviewing as well. So for all the performance audits, if you read my overview, you will see mention being made of the link to the National Development Plan. And that has started from as far back as 2010. Because in finalizing and as a part of the promulgation and awareness raising by PIOJ, thankfully the PIOJ engaged directly with the Auditor General's Department. And since then, we have, as a result of that kind of engagement, we were brought into the process from then. So we have been monitoring the institution's capacity through its institutional framework. So a topic as simple as procurement is with an aim of determining, recognizing that the achievement of this plan means the effective use of the limited resources that we have available. One such objective then of examining the procurement activities of an organization is not just to assess whether or not there is compliance with the guidelines, but to see the benefit to the country from the procurement activity, to determine that, and that's also one of the reasons why we place a lot of emphasis on the strategic business plan of the ministries, departments, and agencies, and I guess that will feed into the whole of government business plan, where I believe there are still some issues in having that time coming together. But it's all, Mr. Chairman, in the interest of ensuring that the agencies are functioning in a manner that will work towards achieving a national development plan. So it may not be embodied in one report, but when you look at my overview and the objectives, that is one of the key aims of the report, to ensure.
So in approaching your work,
yes,
in relation to performance audits, you very much have in mind the National Development Plan and the framework of that, and the extent to it what you're auditing is or is not furthering the national effort towards achieving that. Okay.
And I will generally identify the National Development Plan as well as the Sustainable Development Goals. As it relates to the allocation of funds, I think Jamaica is very fortunate because we have the 91% alignment. So if one plan is being addressed, it means automatically that the other plan is being addressed as well.
All right, thank you. Perhaps we could move on to the next issue in the prompt, since we have quite a lot of ground to cover this morning. So issue 2A relates to the institutional framework. The government of Jamaica has established oversight and governance structures to provide guidance towards the implementation of the SDGs. The National SDG Core Group was formed in 2017, comprising PIOJ, Statin, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, as a successor to the Vision 2030 Interministerial Core Group 3. PIOJ assumed the lead role based on its previously assigned responsibility to monitor the Millennium Development Goals, which were the precursors to the SDGs, and the development of Vision 2030 Jamaica, the National Development Plan. However, we saw no documented evidence to confirm the PIOJ's role as lead agency. Whereas it's admirable that PIOJ took on this role, we found that the lines of accountability were unclear, and further, some MDAs were unaware of this assumed responsibility, which affected coordination between stakeholders. The management's response to that is, this has been rectified by Cabinet Decision Number 6 of 2019, dated March 11th, 2019, which gave approval for the Planning Institute of Jamaica as a national focal point for coordinating the mainstreaming, monitoring, and reporting of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And status verification, the Cabinet decision has been requested. Does that mean you haven't yet seen it then? No.
That's correct.
Yeah, but we will take the management's word for it. All right, thank you. Issue 2B, institutional framework again. In September 2017, Cabinet also approved the establishment of the Oversight Committee for the National 2030 Agenda. That will provide oversight for monitoring the implementation of the SDGs. Membership includes PIOJ, Statin, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, and other MDAs, along with stakeholders from the private sector, civil society groups, and academia. I believe the opposition is on that one. Is that the one that the opposition is represented on? Yes, that's just making sure. Yes, that's it, yes. Yes. Well, you have so many committees here, I don't want to claim to be on one that I'm not. All right. However, the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service, which is the entity responsible for the collection and allocation of public revenue to allow for socio-economic development, was not included in the core group. PIOJ invited the Ministry of Finance to name a representative to the Oversight Committee. The Ministry, however, is yet to name a representative to this committee. At the same time, inclusion of the Ministry of Finance at the level of the core group would facilitate continuous alignment of the medium to long-term funding for priority SDG projects with the government's fiscal program and strengthen coordination of funding arrangements. Management's response to that. In October 2016, as part of the mainstreaming accelerating policy support mission, which resulted in the roadmap for implementation of the SDGs, bilateral discussions were held between the mission team and then Financial Secretary, Mr. Everton McFarlane. The Ministry of Finance and the Public Service was also invited to sensitization sessions on the SDGs via a letter of June 20th, 2017. In constituting the Oversight Committee, all ministries were invited to serve on the committee via their permanent secretaries. Specifically, the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service was invited to nominate a representative. To date, a nominee has not been named. And then now we have another response dated September 30th and October 2nd. The Ministry of Finance's representative and alternates were named to the Oversight Committee via email received from the Financial Secretary to the PIOJ on September 27th, 2019. There have been no meetings of the Oversight Committee since September 2018. 2 points arise from that. But before I get to them, I'll just look at the it does say that the inclusion of the Ministry of Finance and Public Service at the core group level will be discussed at the next meeting of the Oversight Committee. The status and verification, with the last meeting of the National Oversight Committee being held in September 2018, this is contrary to the terms of reference, which requires the committee should meet quarterly or as deemed necessary. And that's one issue I was going to raise. The second response or verification issue, the PIOJ subsequently provided a letter of September 30th, 2019, naming the Deputy Financial Secretary as the representative for the National Oversight Committee. So, first of all, why would the Ministry of Finance take so long to name a representative to the Oversight Committee? What was the reason for this? Does anyone know? Was it just an oversight of the Oversight Committee? Or was there some other issue that was problematic in naming somebody?
So our understanding, Chair, they were invited from the very start, as we indicated here, but the communication was constant in the sense that because of the mechanisms as outlined by the Auditor General, and I want to thank the Auditor General for just the process of reviewing, that because you're looking at the plans of ministries, departments, agencies, their own business and strategic plans, and ensuring alignment with their objectives and Vision 2030, the thought is that as they are achieving their own objectives, you are achieving Vision 2030, and their own objectives would have been funded. And so a lot of the alignment, a lot of the processing of the results framework and the results-based budgeting, what we are moving towards and have been now, and Cabinet Office doing a lot of work to ensure that processing, would ensure that financing. So it wasn't that you would have a gap in the sense that there's no indication, no feedback, no flow of dialogue with finance. And again, now for that VNR we mentioned last year, the high-level presentation at the UN General Assembly, it was very costly, if you will, in terms of what it would require to pull together. And again, they were very much a part of the process. The issue of seeming violation of terms of reference, why we paused from that September 2018 to now, was because of the issue. We had assumed responsibility in terms of the SDG implementation, but there was no formal mechanism no formal authorization from Cabinet naming PIOJ. Because we were doing Vision 2030, it just followed, as we said, because of presentations to Cabinet and that we would be the ones doing it, but there was no formal authorization. And that has since been taken care of. So in that process of seeking formal authorization from Cabinet, we decided not to meet until we were so authorized. And that was a seeming break, if you will. But there was always constant dialogue, and we would say support in terms of ensuring financing. But
so the Oversight Committee hasn't met for over a year because you didn't have official authority to be the focal point for the whole
when it was raised. There's a core group meeting this week.
So as a precursor to the SDGs, to the resumption of the Oversight Committee, there will be a meeting of the SDGs core group this week on the 24th? Yes. On the 24th.
When did the core group last meet?
March of this year.
March 2019.
March 20, was it 22nd? March 19th or 22nd this year. 22nd this year. So we had a meeting of the core group in March, and the next meeting will be this week, and we hope to have a meeting of the Oversight Committee shortly after.
I see. All right. Well, now that you're authorized, we expect to have regular meetings so that the Auditor General doesn't cite us again. We're supposed to meet quarterly or as is necessary, correct?
And
by the way, Auditor AG, where does that requirement come from? The quarterly, is that in the terms
of reference
of the Oversight Committee itself?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Russia?
All right.
I was just adding that there have also, in the interim, we have addressed where possible issues related to the SDGs through the meetings of the thematic working groups.
Thank you.
But there are some very important ones which are not aligned yet. So that's, I mean, for example, I know in justice, there is a National Council on Justice, which is a stakeholder group, and it ought to be meeting, I assume it is. So really that ought to be the thematic working group for justice, and ought to, PIOJ ought to be represented on it so that you can bring that in.
So I'm glad you raised that, Mr. Chair. So the point, to come back to that point, it's not as if, when you speak of meeting fatigue, it is that you had mechanisms in place, as you mentioned, that council, because you had the Security Council, you had mechanisms in place that brought together stakeholders and a wide range. And if the communication, once we effected communication to ensure we were able to be apprised of what was happening, then in that sense, you found when we arranged another meeting, people were saying, well, there are general decisions, outcomes that you can be apprised of. So it's not as if work wasn't happening in the space, and hence the talk of meeting fatigue. And just as you said, you're on the committee, you said, well, there are so many of these committees, and the chances are once we are in line of sight with you and can get feedback in certain ways, then it would possibly negate you having to be present at all committees.
The problem is, though, that those committees are not really focused on the National Development Plan and the Sustainable Development Goals. There may be overlap, I would imagine there is, but it's not really the focus. Certainly, for justice, for example, there is a justice reform project, and that would have been the focus in terms of the wider stakeholder issues around justice, some of which would presumably overlap, but that wasn't really the core purpose, raison d'etre for that committee. So it's quite important from alignment purposes that there be input from the SDG and national development process into these other so-called thematic, but not really thematic working groups. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, all right. Issue 3. This is to do with integration and inclusiveness. Preparatory work towards achieving inclusiveness for the implementation of the SDGs has begun. The Cabinet-approved roadmap for implementation in Jamaica considered vulnerable groups in each of its priorities to advance implementation of the SDGs and recommended targeted strategies to protect vulnerable groups. Further, targeted strategies for vulnerable groups are in place which are coherent with Vision 2030 and other sectoral policies. In October 2017, PIOJ, through the UNDP, engaged Salises, which is up at UE, to develop a Leaving No One Behind report to assess the extent to which marginalized groups will impact the achievement of the SDGs. The report also identified the main groups within the Jamaican society which are at risk of being left behind, as well as identified opportunities for increased social inclusion for at-risk groups. Manager's response: it should be recognized that targeted strategies for vulnerable groups are in place, which are coherent with 2030 vision. These include the National Social Protection Strategy, the National Policy on Poverty and Poverty Reduction Program, the Plan of Action on an Integrated Response to Children Violence, National Policy on Gender Equality, the passage of the Disabilities Bill, which is not yet in effect, the revision of the National Policy for Senior Citizens. While renewed efforts will be made to ensure no one is left behind, this will be done in the context of the National Planning Framework. We don't have a response to that in the status or verification column. So what one gets from this then is that there are various national policies focusing on vulnerable groups and trying to tackle their exclusion from society and the mainstream opportunities of society. Yeah, go ahead.
How do you treat with all right, there may be just a policy but not yet implemented. How does that fit into your national? You put that off as achieved, or no? Because just as you said with the disabilities bill, yes, but it's not yet enacted. So how do you deal with these within the broader scope?
It is enacted. It's a Disabilities Act now, but it has a commencement date provision which has not been brought into effect because there were some preparatory things that had to happen in order to ready the society for the law to be in effect, and that's just taken a very long time.
No, because here it is marked as resolved. So, you know,
challenge in planning that if you know, when we speak about checkboxitis, that if you set as your target to pass legislation, and you do so, you can check the box. But to be effective is a point you're making, and so we are careful in a monitoring and evaluation framework. We are looking at effectiveness in a number of things, and so we have mechanisms in place that we continue to gauge for effectiveness around these matters. So in the issue of the Disabilities Act, now we speak to, you know, there's a National Social Protection Committee which is chaired by the PIOJ, but again multi-stakeholder and represented by persons with disabilities in terms of representative on the board and putting forward those issues to try to resolve. So they would flag, for example, this issue that you raised. You've passed an act and it's not yet promulgated, it's not yet enacted. So it's not good enough that it's passed. You've met one milestone, but in terms of effectiveness. So those are things we continue to monitor.
I mean, there's generally a very wide gap between promulgating a policy or passing legislation and actually having a social impact, you know, because it all turns on the effectiveness of the implementation of the policy or the legislation.
Yes.
So Jamaica has domestic violence legislation, for example, but has very high levels of domestic violence. And similarly, the community of persons with disabilities continue to face all sorts of problems in transportation, in housing, and employment, etc. So that is really what needs to be monitored, I think, to see to what extent those things are actually improving or not. And I hope that is what's being monitored.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So just to reinforce that this audit is looking at the existence of the institutional framework and mechanism for the preparedness for the implementation, looking at the effectiveness of the individual legislation, and policy and programs. No, that's something that is done at an individual level with the ministries, departments, and agencies.
And the reason for asking is, as I said, looking at our own goals. You know, so you'll have different areas of achievement. So it will be the policy, then the legislative side of it, Now, the implementation side of it, what I wanted to satisfy myself about is that we are on the effectiveness of the implementation. You know, because it's one thing in having the law, as the chairman said, about the whole violence, you know, and domestic violence. So, you know, towards our own 2030 goal, reduction of, I'm just using as an example, reduction of domestic violence. I mean, like Manchester is very high with domestic violence. So even though we're setting it as a goal, we have achieved the legislative part and everything, but do we actually achieve it when the implementation side of it has failed? You know, so how is it that we evaluate? Is there a rigorous evaluation system? Because it makes no sense to have the laws, but then the effectiveness is basically
one
very
assumes
low.
the indicators which Statin were referring to, those are dealing with effectiveness, I would imagine, rather than just whether there's a box that's been checked because you've got a law in place or a policy in place. The indicators must, I would imagine, generally address whether or not you're actually making progress in the critical thing that law is supposed to, or that policy is supposed to address. That's what you're measuring, I would imagine, or monitoring. Is that correct?
Yes. At a very broad level, the indicator that we produce look at the national, regional, parish level, whatever the level of disaggregation that those indicators are available in. It would give an indication of the effectiveness, but it's only one component of monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of a policy.
Now, let me add, the Vision 2030 framework has an M&E framework that would look at things like that for effectiveness. Again, and you're hitting the nail on the head, in terms of the NSPC, the National Social Protection Committee. So PIOJ, I chair that committee, multi-stakeholder. One of the things we commend is the representation that's there, because persons, whether persons, senior citizens, persons with disabilities, persons are coming and ensuring those issues. If you're promulgating something new, how does it impact who I represent? And you have that voice, and that's ongoing. So it's an ongoing process of monitoring.
So let's move on then, because I want us to get to Mrs. Palmer as soon as possible. Issue 3. Integration and inclusiveness. In order to raise awareness regarding the SDGs and Vision 2030, there's a national consultation and engagement with stakeholders that PIOJ has initiated. It's executed awareness programs through town hall meetings, presentations, displays to a wide cross-section of stakeholders. In addition, the Oversight Committee established a communication subcommittee in December 2017, charged with various things, including developing and leading the communication program in order to create awareness and understanding of the SDGs over the lifespan of the project. Management's response. The work program for the SDGs Oversight Committee for 2018-2021 consists of 4 components to be implemented systematically and chronologically. Component 1 would be the focus of year 1, followed by the implementation of component 2, stakeholder engagement, advocacy, and communications for the SDGs. Stemming from the inaugural group retreat of the core group held from December 8th to 10th, 2017, this subcommittee for communications was established, comprising specialists in communication from the tripartite membership of the core group. The inaugural meeting of the subcommittee was held on March 1st, 2018, at which time the role of the committee was defined, and it's set out here what it's supposed to do. Create and implement communication activities to raise awareness of SDGs, which can be reported on in the voluntary national review, that's the VNR report, to be presented at the high-level political forum, which happened last year. Develop and lead the communication program to create awareness and understanding of the SDGs over the lifespan of the project. The work program of the committee and the minutes of the March meeting, 2018 meeting, were provided to the audit team. The audit team was also provided with communication and advocacy roadmap 2019 to 2022, which will inform the medium-term communication strategy. So you have a mechanism in place through this committee of the subcommittee of the core group dealing with communications.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's a big priority for us going
Yes.
forward. Big
As it
priority.
should be, yes, indeed. Issue 5, baselines for monitoring and reporting. Statin identified sources of data to report on 119 of the 234 global indicators as at June 2018. That's 51%. There are 234 global indicators applicable to Jamaica. Of these, Statin is only able to measure 90, and Statin, along with the data producers, have developed 29 indicators for use as proxies. Statin is unable to measure the remaining 115 indicators as no data are available. In June 2017, Statin established an internal 2030 Agenda Committee to improve the statistical capacity for monitoring the 2030 Agenda, as well as providing strategic guidance to the MDAs for the production of data. However, we saw no evidence that the internal committee had developed work plans to measure, monitor, and report on the progress to produce these indicators. Statin indicated that resource constraints, including a high staff turnover since 2016, has constrained its ability to improve its statistical activities and production processes included in the monitoring of these indicators. Statin's response, which is dated September 26, 2019, the work program for SDGs is running approximately 2 quarters behind. Statin has been facing significant staffing challenges, and this has adversely affected its work program in this way. We are pleased to advise that in the first quarter of this fiscal year, we were able to assign a senior statistician to focus on leading the monitoring of the SDGs and related development frameworks. She is currently in the process of compiling the second SDG statistical report for Jamaica, which is scheduled to be released in March 2020. With the senior statistician in place, the formalization of the internal SDGs committee should get back on track within the next fiscal year, including work plans as recommended by the audit. Regarding the number of indicators available for Jamaica, as at the last SDGs report, we were able to produce 48.8% of the indicators, including proxies. Another 4.1% have been identified as not applicable to Jamaica. The second SDGs report, which we are currently compiling, will inform whether or not any improvements have been made in this regard. So you're kind of behind in this development work for the indicators that you don't already have, but you have now a senior statistician in place who's working on that, basically. Yeah. Issue 6, baselines for monitoring and reporting. There is no formal monitoring and evaluation M&E framework in place to coordinate and track the progress of systems and programs that are being developed in several MDAs to aid in the implementation of the SDGs. However, the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service has sought external funding to procure software to enhance the government's monitoring capability of public investment projects implemented to support achievement of SDGs. An expected outcome of this monitoring and evaluation data system would be increased accessibility to real-time data tracking of the progress from conceptualization to post-evaluation. This should enhance the capability of the National SDG Core Group to monitor the implementation and progress of the SDG priority projects. And the PIOJ's response of September 30th, 2019, as it indicated before, SDGs will be achieved by the implementation of the Vision 2030 Jamaica National Development Plan. The PIOJ is currently engaged in a tender process for a consultancy to develop a results-based monitoring and evaluation framework and plan for Vision 2030 Jamaica, which reflects the integration of the Sustainable Development Goals in the Vision 2030 Jamaica results chain and theory of change and plan implementation framework. We hope to have a contract in place by November 2019. So, Dr. Henry, you had indicated that within the NDP, the Vision 2030 plan, there is a monitoring and evaluation process within the PIOJ for that already. So, and you're saying, as I understand it, that that is really the M&E process for the SDGs as well. Is that correct? And there's this reference to some software that the government's buying, which will help to do some tracking of data as well.
We are currently pursuing, as said, a tender process to strengthen the M&E framework. We have done some internal strategic review of our M&E framework, and we have seen gaps. And so we are working to strengthen that. At the same time, we recognize that there are gaps that need to be addressed if we are to effectively monitor and evaluate the SDGs. So we're dealing with both within this particular process.
Issue 7, baselines for monitoring and reporting. Statin recognized that the current Statistics Act, as well as the policies of MDNAs, do not mandate adherence to the common statistical standards or require coordination and collaboration of statistics with other MDNAs. Accordingly, in October 2012, Statin wrote to its portfolio ministry recommending amendments to the Act. Cabinet approved proposed amendments in June 2013 and issued drafting instructions to CPC. However, the Act is yet to be amended. Management's response. Regarding the Statistics Act, and this response is of September 26, 2019. Regarding the Statistics Act, since the filling of the vacancy that we had regarding a legal officer earlier this year, we have been able to update the proposed amendments to the Act and have engaged in preliminary discussions with the Minister and the FS in this regard. The proposed amendments are slated to be submitted to our board in October, with a subsequent submission to our parent ministry thereafter. Regarding the NSS, I'm not sure what that is. Since the audit, we conducted an what is NSS?
National Statistics System.
Okay, National Statistics System, or something to that effect. Since the audit, we conducted an NSS workshop and contracted a consultant to draft the Statistics Master Plan. The draft document is scheduled for submission to Statin at the end of September 2019. Well, has that happened? Have you received your draft document from your consultant?
Actually, the consultant was contracted by a development partner, so the submission is to the development partner, and then they'll submit it to us. So Statin has not yet received the official final submission of the Statistics Master Plan as yet from the consultant. We are scheduled to receive it shortly. We have been in dialogue with Paris 21, our development partner.
Who's the development partner?
Paris 21.
Paris 21?
Yes, they are the partnership in statistics for development for the 21st century. It's a very long name. If I could just go back to the point, though, of the amendments to the Statistics Act. The bigger challenge that we've been having that has affected that process moving forward is that we've had a number of reassignments to different line ministries. Since 2013, we've been between the Ministry of Finance and the Office of the Prime Minister, and whenever we are reassigned, we have to restart the submission process. And that has affected us, along with a very high turnover, unusually, with legal officers. We've had one to retirement, one actually passed, and one resigned. So we're on our 4th legal officer right now with regards to the amendments to the Statistics Act. However, we are in a good place right now. We are on schedule, barring no reassignment of Statin, that it will be submitted by the end of the fiscal year. The statistics
to who? Your board?
To our parent ministry.
Oh.
It is important that
and who is your parent ministry now?
The Ministry of Finance.
Oh.
It is important that we amend the Statistics Act because currently it only speaks to the work of Statin. Even though we have been able to use moral suasion to get ministries, departments, and agencies to comply with our guidance, the Statistics Act would seek to strengthen that authority to ensure that there is better coherence when we produce statistics from different entities, to ensure that, for example, when we speak of an industry, we're speaking of the same industry, or when we're speaking of certain classifications, we're using the same standards, and to ensure that whatever is being put out, that it is robust, it passed certain quality checks, and that it is information that we can rely upon to make informed decisions. So that is a very important step in moving forward.
I mean, I must say I'm somewhat shocked and disappointed that this hasn't gone anywhere further than this. We're in 2019,
yes.
And statistics based on data are critical to all kind of policy formulation and decision taking. So if there are gaps in the Statistics Act which have been identified, it ought to be prioritized to fix that. Especially now when going to inflation targeting within the central banking system and monetary policy being, the central bank being primarily about achieving inflation targets set by the government. And so the whole question of how often the basket is updated and all the other issues around the CPI, which has been discussed in the Joint Select Committee, dealing with the Bank of Jamaica Act amendment for that, is all predicated on a robust and adequate system for generating those statistics. So this ought to be prioritized, and I hope that we will move forward with it with greater alacrity.
The Statistics Master Plan is a medium to short-term plan that outlines expenditure for the provision of data, for example, in addition to other developmental work that needs to happen. We had a few workshops in 2017 with a number of ministries, departments, and agencies to look on data quality and how we improve data quality. And we see where there's certain need for capacity building, for training to improve the work of the national statistics system, which is not just Statin. So Statin adheres to a particular standard because we are audited not just by the Auditor General's department, but by our peers. So for example, for the CPI, the IMF actually comes to Statin and reviews our processes to ensure that it is robust. Similarly for the GDP and for other statistics that we produce. But we have to also ensure that the same standard to which we are held, that the other producers of official statistics are held to that same standard. And right now we use moral suasion, but it has to be legislated to ensure that there is strict compliance and that we have the authority to compel persons to produce statistics at a particular standard.
Yes, indeed. All right. Moving on to issue 8, means of implementation. MDAs are required to develop strategic business plans incorporating priorities identified in the Cabinet-approved roadmap for SDG implementation. However, at March 2018, 5 of the 14 MDAs were yet to present these plans for the period 2018-19 to 2020-21. Accordingly, the Office of the Cabinet was unable to complete the whole of government, I believe that stands for, business plan, or be assured that the strategic business plans were aligned to the Vision 2030 Jamaica and the achievement of the SDGs. The whole of government business plan aims to facilitate greater coordination in policy development, program and project implementation, governance and service delivery across the public sector. The whole of government business plan would provide the mechanism for GOJ to monitor and report on its progress towards implementation of the priority activities. At this time, or at the time of this report, the whole of government business plan for 2018-19 to 2020-21 was in draft, which I guess it would have to be because 5 of the 14 MDAs hadn't presented their plans, which go into it. Response from the Office of the Cabinet. This is of September 24th, 2019. The concept of whole of government planning is new to the public sector. A whole of government plan sets out the broad functional and fiscal goals of government over a 3 to 4 year horizon. The plan also outlines how the government of Jamaica's strategic priorities will be pursued and the specific performance indicators and targets will be used to monitor and report on the results. A whole of government strategic business plan was last finalized for the 2016-17 to 2018-19 medium term and approved by the then cabinet just before the change of administration in 2016. With this change of administration and the government's subsequent strategic changes to ministries and portfolio responsibilities, several, in quotes, super ministries were formed in March 2016. As such, the ministries have been undergoing a period of settling. It's a long period. This has affected their planning and performance management processes, which were previously at advanced stages with the implementation of the GOJ Performance Monitoring and Evaluation System, PMES, since 2010. Since 2016, there have been yearly drafts of the whole of government strategic business plan. However, the quality of the draft plans has been affected by the capacity of ministries to effectively engage the strategic planning process and provide their key priority initiatives and related strategies and targets in a timely manner. The Office of the Cabinet is now in the process of overhauling the whole of government business planning process in light of the implementation of the GOJ medium-term results-based budgeting across the public sector. The new whole of government strategic business plan will show an alignment of the SDGs with the national goals and outcomes, strategic priorities of the government, and contributions of priority policies, programs, and projects of MDAs. Seems like we have a whole lot of different things going on. So you have your MTF, which is a rolling 3-year thing, which is a different thing to the whole of government business plan, which you've had problems in finalizing, partly because not all the MDAs have presented their plans on a timely basis. CABSEC, any comments on this?
Not really, and I don't want to unnecessarily burn the period of the committee's time. I apologize again for my late arrival. I think my colleague here had conveyed on my behalf.
This is the penultimate issue before we move on to the energy one. So, yes, feel free to say something about this.
As the response point out, there are 3 things at play here. We were able to put together, and I think you would have been part of that cabinet approval, after a period of, relative constancy in portfolios. And the change up in portfolio is not just the creation of super ministries. Since 2016, of course, post 2016, there have also been movements of components of portfolios, and not all at the time the major configuration took place. But also the introduction now of the medium-term results-based budgeting also means we have to, in a sense, reconfigure the framework and approach to be taken. But just to underline that approach has always embedded National Vision 2030. And I think, as has been commented here with respect to some other aspects, largely, if you are implementing the Vision 2030 goals and outcomes, you are pretty much covering the SDGs, with obviously some tweaking in some cases, and my colleague spoke to the difficulty of setting targets for individual countries at a global level, UN and so on. So that is where we are, and I think that we have had the performance monitoring and evaluation branch in the Cabinet Office has been very heavily engaged in seeking to improve, and I think this is what this report is about. It's really to do with capacity, institutional capacity. So the PMEB has been very much engaged in seeking to build the capacity of ministries, agencies, departments in terms of the strategic planning and so on. In fact, quite a lot of effort of that unit right now is really engaged on that, and sometimes I have to say to Mr. Gray, and I think I'll ask him perhaps to give a little bit more information on what we are doing. Sometimes I have to express my concern that the time being spent with individual ministries, agencies, while extremely valuable and helpful to us in the long run, may also have some negative aspects in terms of the work of the unit itself. But that is absolutely essential. Without that capacity in place across the system, we are not going to get the kind of result that we would want to. But Mr. Gray, who is the CTD in charge of the PMEB, I don't know if you want to add anything to elaborate a little more.
Mr. Gray, a brief elaboration.
Thank you, Chair, members. I'm Sean Gray. What we're trying to do is to move to a framework where we can actually align results of ministries to the budgets that are allocated. in order to do that, we're introducing or helping ministries to build their capacity in strategic planning and the necessary forecasting methodologies that they need to embrace with projecting their targets. And it's important that we keep on refining this because our budgeting framework now will be on the medium term. So our results framework have to be fairly accurate in terms of our medium term results that we expect from our policies, our programs, and some of our projects. So, we struggle at the Cabinet Office to balance, to ensure that we are doing the planning, our planning at that level at a pace and also at a standard that will ensure that we are getting better results for the resources that we are investing.
Okay, thank you. Last issue, means of implementation. The roadmap of SDG implementation identified 9 sources of funding for priority projects. To date, there's been progress in pursuing 6 of these to various degrees. Public-private partnerships have been a major source of funding, whereas diaspora bonds and venture capital funding are in exploratory stages. Since the adoption of SDGs in 2015, the Development Bank of Jamaica records showed that 1 PPP was completed, 3 are in progress, and 4 are under review. In November 2017, PIOJ, with World Bank loan funding, engaged a consultant to conduct a market study to determine the feasibility of a floating diaspora bond. To date, the decision to issue a bond is pending. Further, the intention of the DBG venture capital program is to create sustainable development by focusing on the establishment of an ecosystem conducive to venture capital development. However, a comprehensive long-term strategy to fund the priority projects and support delivery of SDGs remains outstanding. Management's response. The Vision 2030 Jamaica plan through the medium-term framework is the mechanism through which progress towards the SDGs will be achieved. Implementation of Vision 2030 is primarily resourced by the Government of Jamaica through budgets allocated to MDAs and support from international development partners through loans, grants, and technical assistance. The use of Vision 2030 as an implementation mechanism negates the need for a separate strategy. All right. So does that mean the roadmap needs to be redesigned then? Because the roadmap seems to contemplate something sort of focused primarily on the SDG implementation as opposed to the normal budgeting process and the normal sources of funding that government has to do what it wants to do. So I don't know if there's some need for alignment in this regard.
So when we contemplate possible sources of funding, you're looking at a long term going forward. So the mechanism now is through the Vision 2030 and the alignment with the funds there. As needs for, say, a bond would arise, if it were determined, that's really the purview of the Ministry of Finance in terms of, if you're going to issue bond financing. As it is now, we have, through the budgets of the MDAs, as well as support from the IDPs, we are seeing through the medium term the sources of funding going forward. The government is in the context where we're realizing more fiscal space. It may again negate. So what we may have contemplated at some time as possible sources of funding, as we go forward, we may realize we may not at this time draw upon it. But in the issue of financing in terms of bond requirements and so, that would be, in the discussion with the committee, now including, of course, Ministry of Finance in a more in a closer way to be determined. But the call for another strategy, it's really the MTF and the Vision 2030 mechanism that would determine funding going forward as we ensure alignment, as we ensure that the goals that are set at the MDA level is aligned to Vision 2030 and the SDGs, then we would say those fundings being realized.
Yeah, so the roadmap may be a little out of date at this point then, in this regard.
In regard to the bond, the specific reference to bond financing, maybe so. But we continue to look at it in terms of again, the current priorities. So Ministry of Finance will determine. So if they would determine, but listening in those discussions, we would say maybe not at this time. So not out of date in the sense that it will no longer be relevant at any other time, but just saying that as we continue to refresh and monitor, then that is in a toolkit, but obviously not at this time to be contemplated.
Who was the consultant that was engaged in 2017, November?
For financing?
There was a consultant apparently to conduct a market study to develop the feasibility of the floating of a diaspora bond. Who was that consultant?
Was it through DBJ? We'd have to check. We're not fully sure, Chairman. We'll get back to you.
Okay, because it says the PIOJ with loan financing did this. So.
Okay.
Yeah. Not sure who that is. All right. I think here I end this lesson then. Thank you very much for coming. You're free to, if you're interested and have the time, to stay and listen to, because what we're moving to next also affects the SDGs, and it's to do with one of them in particular, number 7, affordable and clean energy, which is outcome 10 of the Vision 2030 plan, which is diversification of energy supply and sustainable development goals. Yes.
Mr. Chair, you're giving us the option to leave, and we will do so, leaving no one behind. So our own entire team would probably depart at this time.
All right.
If so that is okay with the committee.
I know you spent a lot of time here this morning, and I thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us.
Yeah. Mrs. Palmer, I would invite you to come forth and with your team. So, welcome, Mrs. Palmer. Thank you very much for coming. Perhaps you could just quickly identify who you have with you, and then I will ask the Auditor General just to give us a quick overview of what this report is about, how it came about, and so on, and then we'll just quickly go through the prompt. Yes. 1 second. Sorry, Mr. Williams, could you just turn on the mic for, I think it's the one behind, yeah, just press that. Yeah, go ahead, Mrs. Palmer.
Yes, on my left is Fitzroy Vidal, Principal Director, Energy in the Ministry of Science, Energy and Technology. On my right is Robert Clark, Acting CEO of PCJ. And behind me, yes, is Sandra Buchanan, Principal Director for Strategic Planning Policy, Research, Monitoring and Evaluation, Division of the Ministry.
Thank you very much. Welcome to all of you. Madam Auditor General, if you could just lead us into this.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The audit focused on the Government of Jamaica's progress towards Vision 2030, National Development Plan Outcome Number 10, Diversification of Energy Supply, and Sustainable Development Goal Number 7, Affordable and Clean Energy. And largely we sought to determine whether the government is on track to diversify Jamaica's energy supply with emphasis on renewable energy activities on biofuel. So we evaluated whether there was clear policy environment, governance, and implementation of renewable energy sources and the processes adopted for implementation of the National Energy Plan. We also sought to determine whether there was evidence of long-term cross-government planning, communication, and linkages among key stakeholders in developing strategies for energy diversification, and to assess the progress made in increasing the contribution of renewable energy sources in Jamaica's energy mix relative to stated targets. So largely, we noted important progresses in the areas of energy diversification program in terms of research, policy design, and project implementation, despite the relevant sub-policies to support the regulatory framework remaining in draft since 2010. We noted, however, deficiencies in aspects of MSET stakeholder involvement and communication, which we believe contributed to the lack of, I would say, coherence among the various partners and common understanding of the roles and responsibilities of each participating, I would say, MDA. The other issues, Mr. Chairman, relate to PCJ, and I really won't elucidate on those issues because I think by and large, based on steps taken since then, these issues would have resolved themselves. So I'll turn back over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have on page 3 of the prompt the energy mix targets, renewable energy mix targets. And as stated here, 2009, 9% was the target, 2012, 11%, 2015, 12.5%, and then 2030, 20%. I don't know if these are still the targets. I know I've heard more ambitious targets being stated in certain quarters. I'm not sure what the official targets are at this time, but perhaps Mrs. Palmer could give an indication as to what we're currently looking at in terms of where we want to get to with the renewable energy mix as a percentage of our overall energy supply.
I'm going to ask Mr. Vidal to speak because we are currently in the final stages of the integrated resource plan for energy, and so he's a point person working with our players, and of course he's been at it longer than I have been.
Thank you. Mr. Vidal.
Morning, Chair. Morning, members. Sure. So the National Energy Policy 2009 to 2030 is still the framework which provide guidance and which we seek to implement. That policy announced 20% renewable energy by 2030. And that 20% included electricity, transportation, just renewables in the energy mix. By the time we got to about 2011 or so, 2012 thereabout, the then minister felt it was necessary to give greater focus to the electricity sector. And so although our framework was for 20% renewables in the energy mix, the minister felt it was important for us to, within that 20% framework, to have 30% of the electricity contribution coming from renewables by 2030. 2030. So 20% total renewables in the energy mix, 30% of electricity. Persons might recall that because renewables were then relatively new and we had to incentivize the take-up of these technologies. As the market matured, as projects were implemented, as persons become more comfortable with technologies, there was a greater push that we could achieve even more than were set as targets. So with the level of incentives that was offered, fiscal incentives primarily, the market continued to mature, and so most recently the Prime Minister announced that he wanted 50% of renewables coming from 50% of the energy mix coming from renewables. So while 30% from electricity, 20% is still the policy guide that we work with, we are currently, after 10 years, reviewing the national energy policy, updating it based on what we think are some successes, and as new information comes to the table, we're updating that through a project that is currently funded to update the energy policy, and it is within that context. Issues to do with the sub-policies will be updated within the new framework.
Give us an idea of some of the sub-policies that we're referring to there.
Right, so in 2009, 2010, we contemplated a waste-to-energy sub-policy, a biofuel sub-policy, energy conservation efficiency sub-policy, renewable energy sub-policy, and a carbon emissions trading sub-policy. Of course, as soon as the Climate Change Department was established circa about 2012, the issue of carbon emissions trading was more centralized in that ministry. Again, as we look to implement the current policy, the issue of electric mobility is high on the agenda, and we have now added that to one of the policies that we must implement.
Electric mobility?
Electric mobility, so include electric vehicles, cars, etc. And buses, of course.
Are any of the sub-policies finalized yet, or they're still drafts?
Right, so just to be clear as to when we say we had these policies in draft, the energy policy became effective 2010. The drafts, final drafts, were submitted to Cabinet about 2011, and Cabinet in its wisdom felt that we should hold on to these some policies until there was more experience in the marketplace, and we have those policies in draft since then, with new information as they come. The two that have been prioritized, given the current framework, is the waste-to-energy policy and the electric mobility policy. The waste-to-energy policy is far advanced. We have done most of the research work and the groundwork, only now for appropriate consultation to take place, final consultation, and because we had done consultation in the previous era when the policies were developed, it is just to make sure that if whatever is new is brought back to the key stakeholders as to how we're going to treat with some of these prescriptions. So that is far advanced, and we expect to complete the waste-to-energy policy certainly in this financial year. The electric mobility policy is taking a two-stage approach, a strategic electric mobility framework. We would like to have that completed by December of this year, and hopefully move now, and the plan is to move to a policy, of course, in the next financial year, to be completed in the next financial year.
And you're saying that, based on what has been said by the Prime Minister, the overall energy mix percentage to be in the form of renewables, we're hoping to achieve a 50% by 2030?
Correct. So that is the prescription the Prime Minister has dictated, and we think this is not insurmountable, because while the focus has been on the electricity sector, we recall that the greater use of imported petroleum goes to the transportation sector, and there's been less than adequate effort on the transforming that sector in terms of renewable energy. We believe that the opportunity exists for biodiesel, which is something that we think can help us to get to 2030 with 50%, and that is where some of the focus is right now. 2030, yes, 50% of in the energy mix.
Okay. I mean, electric cars are very much where the world is moving.
That's right.
But would that be part of the energy sector?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Yes.
In fact, Chairman and members, we're also going to be getting involved with multi-agency, multi-sector discussions, because our public transportation system, our buses, is the largest consumer of fuel, and we want to see how we can bring that there. So yes, cars, but our emphasis will be on the largest users of fuel.
Okay.
Mr. Palmer, you said the transportation sector is the largest user of, that include buses, trailers, no, that's what I want to clarify. Public transport.
Yes.
Yeah. Buses and
The
taxis.
Buses,
yes.
you don't include haulage, which is commercial.
Mr. Vida, you want to talk that?
Sure. No.
Right.
Transportation. I also want to know if it's just public.
So what happens, and Pierce made the point that it is the largest users. Now, a part of the paradigm is inefficient use. So you target the largest users, and we all know the problems associated with the public transportation fleets in terms of efficiencies and their operational challenges. So if we target the public buses, haulage, the JDF, for example, fleet, the police fleet, we know exactly where the large users are, and if we go in a very targeted way, we believe we can make the transition.
Yes, Mrs.
Good morning. What I wanted to find out is how will that be done? Would it be an upgrade in these transportation, or are we purchasing new transportation for this type of renewable energy?
The information available to us is that there is some work looking at how we change a mix with some of the existing fleet, but the intention is to move to the adoption of a framework where we will, for new vehicles, for government's fleets, we will be shifting from these fossil fuel vehicles to the electric vehicles. So it's a structured approach that we're going to be taking, and that's why, and we have our international donor partners with us. The IDB is funding our strategic framework document right now. The mission is here this week, and they will be assisting us with all the multi-stakeholder consultations that we have to do. And then we are also, I think next week is the mission under the GEF coming out of the UNDP for the other policies, because when we look at it, there are several elements to the electric mobility agenda. So it's not just going to be a framework, or it's not going to be a single policy, but it will be policies to deal with the various elements of what we have to do.
Yes, Member Phillips.
And I'm glad that the PS touched on it, because when I had raised my hand, I wanted to ask about if these agencies like the JUTC and the Ministry of Energy, if there is any connection or any communication. Because, and why I ask is because just that IDB that you spoke about, I saw a report where they're suggesting for public transport, electric buses, and where now the JUTC has gone to LNG buses, which is not CNG or whichever, but it is not used widely in public transport. The CNG and the LNG is not used widely in public transport, right?
It's as far as we understand, it's testing, but in July, we had a series of consultations, multi-stakeholder consultations, under the agenda, again with the IDB. And so there will be multi-stakeholder participation in this process. In fact, I've just responded to the PIOJ because the Ministry of Science, Energy and Technology has been asked to chair this multi-stakeholder approach, but all sectors will be involved in the activities. The ministry is not going to be prescribing to everybody. It's going to be
but it ought to guide the
yes,
policy moving forward.
Yes,
even though,
but we have to get people's buy-in. And
no,
you
but
know,
why I'm touching on the JUTC, because originally, even though there are 5 buses delivered, it should have been, I think, between 10 and 15. And the infrastructure has to be built out for these units to be regasified. No, these CNG or LNG buses that we're speaking about. And if you're going to the infrastructure itself, be it that the supply of the gas itself had put in these, but to test these buses is not a cheap venture, you know, and that's why I ask about the linkages between these government agencies and the parent ministry in the way forward in dealing with this diversification.
Sure.
Because many a times we come to committees like this, there's one policy for the ministry and another policy for the agency, and there's no cohesiveness between meeting at a midpoint, but they're doing something different, which costs the taxpayers at the end of the day. So, you know, going forward with the public transport, and as I said, my research showed me also that CNG and the LNG is not widely used in public transport. So why then would the only government entity that supply public transport then go the way when our funding agencies is suggesting another route also?
Right. So if I might just add to say that in search for solutions, several pilot projects were undertaken, right? And our own PCJ here was involved in the piloting or the pilot work being done with JUTC as far as CNG, LNG, and electric mobility. Again, we must also bear in mind that technology is always developing, so what was not possible very recently is becoming more and more possible. For example, we were told that electric buses or whatever cannot travel certain terrain and all that kind of thing. I'm recently coming back from a tour of an electric mobility transport sector, and that just threw everything through the window. It depends on how you approach it. So what we're trying to do is to make sure that all the key stakeholders are at the table, part of this consultative process, and the technical working group that will be looking at all of these issues before we come to the point of a policy. As a matter of fact, it's among the reasons why we're not gone straight to a policy. We're developing a strategic framework, a framework to make sure that we understand all the issues, not just the buses, not just the charging stations requirement, not just the public fiscal arrangements that has to be put in place since you're moving from one fuel to another, which has a potential of upsetting the fiscal regime. All those issues are part of the electric mobility strategic framework that we are assessing, and our commitment is to bring all the parties to the table.
And perhaps very importantly is the communication, right, to engage our citizens and all stakeholders in the marketplace, because it is very critical. We have also learned that there are some makers of vehicles who will no longer be making fossil fuel vehicles as of 2030. Jamaica does not wish to be the dumping ground for these vehicles. So we have a lot of information that's coming in, and we have to process, and we have to get ourselves in gear to meet what is upon us.
Yes, Member Johnson.
Mr. Vidal, the waste to energy, which has been running the mill for a long time, administration after administration. The last time I remember, I think it's PAAC, there was by-ministry or by-agency collaboration between local government, solid waste, and PETRH PCJ. I read something in the paper recently. Today? Yeah, today. Yes, this morning. Tell us, as a person on the outside, I can't fathom why we have not had any significant
And in fact, there was some dissonance between the chairman of the Solid Waste Authority and the chairman of the enterprise team looking at the divestment, or if that's a privatization of the waste to energy.
Sure.
Clear our minds.
Right. So waste to energy or energy from waste has two major components. Waste management, which is remit of the Ministry of Local Government and Community Development through the NSWMA. And then you have the electricity, waste to energy, which is the remit of the ministry in relationship with the OU, the generation procurement entity. And so there are two separate components. Those components must come together for the waste energy project, for our waste energy project to be implemented. Yes, we have had several iterations, and the Prime Minister established an enterprise team which brought stakeholder representations from NSWMA, Ministry of Local Government, the Ministry, Ministry of Finance, under the Secretariat of the Development Bank of Jamaica. And those discussions, and we've got support from the IFC, World Bank, to do some feasibility studies and look at some options as to the way forward. This is extremely important because this coming together has helped us to look at what are the options going forward. How can it be implemented? What are the policy imperatives that need to be addressed? What are the regulatory arrangements which ought to be addressed? And they study the reports. Some interim reports have come forward already, but as we go along, we get the other reports in that respect. However, the PS mentioned earlier the advanced stage of the integrated resource plan. And the plan will outline the electricity development trajectory for the next 20 years. And rest assured that waste energy is represented in that plan. Now, issues to do with feedstock or the volume of the enterprise team is seeing possibilities for up to 40 megawatts. The integrated resource plan only makes provision for 18 megawatts, well within what we know can be managed. Of course, these are modular systems to be upgraded as you go along. But yes, waste energy take a long time to get the policy out. It's because of the issues in terms of the waste management to come together with the electricity generation from waste. And the efforts now are to make sure that it comes together appropriately.
Mr. Savella, you speak only about, on the energy side, electricity. But aren't there other energy options in terms of output other than electricity?
Right.
I've heard in the past different fuels which would not go towards electricity necessarily, but transportation and other areas. Is that part of it, or is it exclusively electricity? And secondly, much of what I'm hearing seems to imply that there is an unavoidable role for the government in it. Are there opportunities, or is there any in the policy design for private sector investment in utilizing waste, either in terms of the whole of the garbage disposed to solid waste, or components of it that could be used in one of the output products, meaning electricity or fuel?
So to the first question concerning other byproducts or output from the waste to energy or waste management, yes, certainly there is the issue of the matter of methane gas mining, which will not be necessarily impacted by a waste to energy, because this is natural gas which escapes from combustion in terms of but for that to happen efficiently in an optimal way, then we have to move away from, can I say, dumps to proper sanitation management arrangement so that gas can be mined appropriately in the volumes and with the level of optimization that would be necessary. So yes, there are other sources of fuel that could come from it, but we have to be careful that we don't use one to compromise the other. That's the first point.
Members, I want to make sure that we complete the work that we are supposed to complete today, and it's 12:31. Just if we could just, rather than pursue the discussion around energy options and so on, if we could just get through the prompt, and then we can probably have a little, if we have a chance to maybe have some broader discussions at the end. Briefly, we could try and do that. But the first item, issue 1, relates to the sub-policies for the national electricity policy, or the national energy policy. You've indicated that 2 of those have been prioritized, electric mobility and energy from waste.
Correct.
And there are several others. You also indicated that you're not really looking to finalize a policy, but rather a strategic framework. Could you just kind of explain that as to where you're heading?
A policy is the ultimate objective, but that we're getting there in 2 stages. The first stage, which we intend to complete by December of this year, is to frame the issues in a strategic electric mobility framework, right? And that's what the consultation is all about, to make sure that we understand all the issues, that we develop strategies to treat with them all, and therefore puts us in a position now to craft the considerations into a policy document. And policies, PS is reminding, because you need to have a policy for electric mobility, yes, but you also need a policy for charging stations. You need a policy for several other components associated with this.
Is there a time frame for when you hope to have completed this process?
Right, so as I mentioned earlier, the electric mobility strategy framework should be completed before the calendar year, and the electric vehicle policy, mobility policy, next financial year.
By the end of the next financial year?
Yes.
So that would be March 2021?
Yeah, because we're getting assistance next week to start the work on the concept document. And then we will move from that into the policies.
Thank you. Next issue. We noted the important progress made in Jamaica's energy diversification program in terms of research, policy design, funding, and project implementation, especially in the areas of wind, solar, and natural gas. In 2012, the Jamaica Energy Council was established to facilitate broad-based consultation and coordination amongst stakeholders. It operated up to December 2015, and there's a cabinet decision of June 2019 re-establishing this council, and the first meeting has been held. So that, I don't think there's much more to say on that, other than it's good that it has resumed after a almost four-year gap. Next issue. This is to do with financing, and the ministry, in coordinating with the Ministry of Finance, obtained loan financing from the World Bank for unlending by the DBJ managed National Energy Fund. At August 2017, $5.3 million US of loans had been disbursed to small and medium-sized enterprises for renewable energy and energy efficiency projects. The level of uptake indicates a demand for funding support for energy diversification efforts. Management's response is that concessionary loans to the MSME sector for renewable energy and energy efficiency were funded through this project, the Energy Security Efficiency and Enhancement Project, by loan funds from the World Bank. These funds were accessed through the DBJ. There has been, since then, significant growth in the local renewable energy sector. The market has matured and there's a reduced demand for fiscal incentives. When you say fiscal incentives here, do you mean that financing, other sources of financing from the domestic market have become available for this, as opposed to the World Bank's loan funding? Or are you talking about tax and customs incentives and so on?
Right,
I'm just trying to understand what, and I mean, the thrust of this is that the demand for this is such that the World Bank facility, may not be sufficient going forward, or it may have been fully disbursed. I don't know what its status is, but what is the plan for enabling MSMEs in particular to access financing for energy efficiency and renewable energy purposes?
Sure. So the World Bank loan financing mechanism was to stimulate the market, bring concessionary loan financing to support small, medium-priced enterprises. In collaboration and conjunction with that, we had duty concessions for renewable energy and solar, all things related to energy efficiency and renewable energy development. All those incentives are still in place, and so we find the market is responding very well. Investors are able to develop their own projects, help support clients, whether they're on the grid or off the grid, or combinations thereof through net billing programs. So the entire incentive scheme has been in place and is allowing the market to, on its own, pretty much develop renewable energy solutions, improve the efficiencies, and ultimately productivity of these companies.
Is this World Bank line of concessionary financing still available, or has it been fully drawn down? Do you know?
Fully drawn down.
So that being the case, what is the source of financing for this going forward?
Right. So the support was to strengthen the infrastructure, the mechanisms to facilitate these undertakings. With the duty concessions in place now, and it's a very competitive marketplace, businesses are finding it far more attractive because some of the market players on the investment side are providing the solutions and the financing. So for example, we talk about energy service companies, ESCOs. And while we have not had many large energy service companies in Jamaica doing from feasibility assessment, project development, implementation, monitoring and evaluation, and also the performance monitoring in terms of paying for it through savings. We have companies that have partnered overseas and local, which are providing these solutions. So the market is pretty much matured and it's on its own now, supporting these to a competitive basis.
You're satisfied that MSMEs have access to financing for this purpose going forward sufficiently? You feel that the market is providing that to them for energy, renewable, using or converting to renewable energy or implementing energy efficiency activities?
Right. So, for example, the net billing program that the government has introduced, whereby companies or persons can generate their own electricity from renewable energy sources and sell the excess to the grid. The level of applications the ministry is seeing and processing suggests that there's significant take-up taking place. Well over 1,000 licenses have been already issued. Applications, and about 800 odd has been issued, and we see applications coming in ever so often. So we know that the market is alive.
What size enterprises are making these applications typically?
We get them from all levels. We get from residential households up to 10 kilowatt-hour systems, and we get small and medium-sized up to very large systems. So it's a range across the spectrum of allowable.
All right, thank you. Moving on, the ministry, in accordance with the National Energy Policy, commissioned research aimed at ascertaining the viability and economic impact of available renewable energy sources such as wind, solar, hydro, biofuels, and biomass. The research undertaken supported implementation of various projects such as the LNG terminal in Mo Bay in November 2016, Wigton Wind Farm commissioned 24 megawatts of wind power in June 2016, Blue Mountain Renewables, which is a wind project and solar voltaic plant in August 2016, etc. Management's response. The integrated resource plan once approved and enforced, will provide additional opportunities for the growth of the renewable energy sector. The implementation of the Integrated Resource Plan, or IRP, is of critical importance, as this will inform the electricity planning and, among other things, how the expansion of renewables as part of the total energy mix will be executed going forward. Renewable studies, including hydro feasibility studies, wind mapping, solar mapping, biomass feasibility studies, and grid impact assessment of increased penetration of renewables, have been made available on the Ministry's and the PCJ's website. It is recognized that these studies are indicative and require further analysis, particularly in relation to the technology solutions and location employed by the investor. The Ministry notes that there was an increase in energy activities, and these include, and there's a list here of various projects which have taken place or are under construction. All right. I think we can move on. Issue 2. This concerns deficiencies that were identified in the regulatory and governance framework and in stakeholder involvement and communication. The energy policy requires the Ministry to design incentives to encourage participation of local financial institutions in financing renewable and non-renewable energy projects. The development and communication of a comprehensive schedule of incentives would provide policy certainty and contribute to an investor-friendly environment for energy diversification. Although the Ministry contacted the Ministry of Finance seeking relief from import duties for equipment connected with renewable energy plants, to date, the Ministry has not submitted a comprehensive program of incentives for review and approval by the Ministry of Finance, consistent with the requirements of the energy policy. And management has responded to that, indicating that in 2015, representation was made to the Ministry of Finance for fiscal incentives to encourage renewables and energy efficiency, and that was approved. In 2016, Ministry got approval for a second set of fiscal incentives in this regard. The positive response of the market to incentives was such that the demand for more incentives, as new technologies were emerging, necessitated another request to the Ministry of Finance, which was supported by a report, Impact Assessment for Duty and Tax Exemption, from the Ministry, highlighting the upward trend in renewables penetration and the impact of reducing petroleum imports and greenhouse gas emissions. And the following incentives are in place: net billing, which allows consumers to generate renewables for their own use and sell electricity at excess supply to the grid. A list of renewable items were promulgated for duty-free concessions. Prices for renewables devices have decreased as their introduction to the market has been facilitated, and there are other incentives to the renewable sector: GCT relief, common external tariff relief, partial exemption of 5% for energy efficiency. Renewables generated by licensed operators must be taken by the grid, and there's a 15% additional rate payable for net billing and concessionary loans to MSMEs. And the Auditor General's verification of this says in October 2019, the Ministry submitted to the Auditor General's Department correspondence to the Ministry of Finance from December 4th, 2017, indicating that the Ministry had prioritized another list of energy saving and efficiency items for which relief from import duties was being requested. This letter was not brought to the attention of the Auditor General's Department when the PA report was tabled in December 2017. So there is another pending request from October this month, apparently, for another list of energy saving and efficiency items.
No, sir, it was from
the
2017.
Oh, yes.
But in preparing, after I got the notice
I see.
for today, well, for this session, as we went through, we found that the Auditor General had not been furnished with this.
With that, I
this
see.
Early, so
okay. Okay. The energy policy envisaged the development of biofuels, such as ethanol and biodiesel, would be part of agriculture and land use policy and plans, especially given the conflicts between land and water use versus for food versus biofuels. A joint task force was established in March 2009 with the Ministry of Energy and the Ministry of Agriculture in respect of biofuels development. Although matters related to land use, such as mapping and agricultural zoning, were deliberated, we found no evidence that the process had advanced since 2009. Management's response: in 2009 or since then, pursuant to the EU's Sugar Transformation Program, a land suitability and mapping study was conducted, which identified suitable areas for the production of feedstock for biofuels. A biofuels feasibility study was done by the ministry under a trilateral agreement with the US and Brazil and Jamaica, demonstrating that Jamaica could satisfy the demand on it for sugar, rum, and ethanol if the available lands were put back into production. However, a change in government saw the sugar factories being privatized and the thrust to develop biofuels waned. In 2019, the PCJ and the DBJ started a process of introducing to the market the investment possibility of biofuels through a public forum. The PCJ and DBJ are currently preparing a request for proposals to seek investors in biodiesel. There's much to say on that. We get now to the question of the energy mix, which we've already had a discussion on. Yeah. I don't know if we need to go over this again. You've explained how the targeting has worked itself out. I mean, the point is made in the prompt, though, that in reporting performance on consumption from the RE mix as at 2014-15, PCJ reported actual energy consumption of 8%, while the ministry indicated renewable supply of 12.5% in line with the target. So there was a discrepancy between those two numbers. We noted the disparity of the reported outcomes and found that while PCJ measured actual energy consumption consistent with the National Energy Plan, the ministry measured the composition of energy mix using total installed capacity. So that different approach of measurement resulted in two different percentages. And there's a management response to this, that there are in fact 4 targets and indicators in the energy plan. The medium-term socioeconomic framework 2015-18 only had 2 of the targets listed for monitoring in the energy sector. The ministry has been monitoring 3 targets as reported in the Economic and Social Survey, and those are energy intensity, percentage of renewables in the energy mix, and total households with electricity. Those are the 3 things that the ministry has been monitoring. A 4th target, which is greenhouse gas emissions, became the responsibility of the Climate Change Division in 2012. The underachievement of the energy intensity target is due in part to a change in government policy to allow the private sector to implement the LNG project. Consequently, there was a 2-year delay in introducing natural gas, which is a less energy-intensive fuel compared to liquid petroleum. As it relates to inconsistency in figures reported by the PCJ and the ministry regarding renewable supply, the ministry reported on installed capacity at the time, while the PCJ reported on renewables as a percentage of the energy mix. Going forward, reports will emphasize which indicators being utilized at any time to ensure clarity. So I think that's just purely making it clear what is being reported on and what metric is actually being employed. Issue 3, this is to do with the oversight framework by PCJ for the for PEL, which is the subsidiary of PCJ, the former subsidiary of PCJ, Petroleum. What's the name of the company?
Petrojam Ethanol.
Petrojam Ethanol, thank you. And there's some comments here about that. And basically there was an inadequate framework of accountability. And there's reference, in fact, to a plant, an actual $40 million capacity ethanol plant, which was established by Petrojam Ethanol. I don't know what the current status of that plant is, but perhaps we could get an update on that. It's mothballed. Have we sold it?
No, it's not yet sold.
Is it for sale?
No, it's not. We are currently in the process of implementing cabinet decision, which is to roll Petrojam ethanol back into Petrojam, and it becomes a part of that establishment, and the issue of the plant will be addressed within that context.
Yes, Mr. Campbell.
Yes, can you say whether or not the evaluation which was done for Petrojam included whatever you describe as being mothballed?
No, it would not have included that because...
But it sits on the ground, on the land which is owned by Petrojam.
Yes.
And fixed to the land.
Yes.
And so...
But also there are other assets of PEL, not many, that's on the property, which would not have been valued in the property of Petrojam.
Well, I would imagine that on consolidation into Petrojam's balance
be a
sheet,
new valuation.
the assets would have been consolidated as PEL was a subsidiary of it. So if you're looking at the financial statements of Petrojam, any evaluator would have picked it up in that way.
It's a subsidiary of PCJ at the moment.
It's not a subsidiary of Petrojam.
It is not no. It's going to be rolled into Petrojam.
It probably would not
with
have
the
been
work that we're
consolidated.
doing now. PCJ, yes, it was separated from Petrojam with the Petrocarib agreements.
Right.
So we are
right
dealing with that now.
So in other words, in the acquisition of the shares of the minority shareholder in Petrojam, those assets would not have been part of it, as you said, because it was not a subsidiary of Petrojam at the time.
Right, I would not think so.
Mm-hmm. No. All right. Okay. In response to this, the management response is the parent-subsidiary relationship with PCJ was not ideal, and PL was not consistent in submitting quarterly and biennial reports to the Ministry and the Ministry of Finance. In keeping with the policy of categorization and rationalization of public bodies and Cabinet's decision, PL was subsumed into the Petrojam, resulting in lower overheads and ultimately a reduced cost of fuel. And that was the situation that existed before the Venezuelan investment in Petrojam, which is what the PS just told us. Moving on, we found that PCJ's oversight framework for PL was deficient. I don't know if we want to get into this. We're aware of all of the deficiencies that were highlighted in the Auditor General's report on PCJ and Petrojam, which have been litigated extensively in this committee over many months. I don't think we need to focus on that now. Moving to issue 4, the dehydration plant, rated at 40 million US gallons per year, has been unutilized since August 2013. Just looking at what happened in Alpa, these plants, when they're unutilized for protracted periods, they depreciate in value rapidly. So I don't know what the plan is for this plant. Would you leave that to the board of Petrojam to determine going forward then, since it's being rolled back into Petrojam?
I would say so, sir, because our focus right now is on the reintegration into Petrojam.
There's some discussion about the performance audit report of December 2017 stated that PL undertook a program of growing sugarcane and making high-grade molasses in 1989. And then they say at no point did PL undertake a program of growing sugarcane and making high-grade molasses. This is just management saying that something that was in the AG's report wasn't factual, and the AG's report points out that the website of Petrojam said that this was the case. I think it's just pointing out that if there was an error, it wasn't the Auditor General's error. It came from Petrojam's own website. All right. And the last issue on the prompt is again to do with this 40 million US dollar capacity plant. Petrojam Ethanol commissioned a study at a cost of $12 million suggesting feedstock options that were considered economical and suitable for local production. These were discussed at the board of PEL in November 2016 with PCJ and a representative of the sugar company. However, to date, the PL board has not communicated its intention to stakeholders, and there is no evidence of medium-term or long-term strategies for the local supply of sugarcane as feedstock for the dehydration plant. This has created uncertainty for stakeholders in terms of strategic planning for the feedstock production and retail trade for petrol. And the response from management is that in 2009 it was deemed uneconomical to purchase feedstock, which is hydrous ethanol, owing to increased prices from Brazil. So dehydration of ethanol ceased. This was also the case in the private sector. The price differential has remained unfavorable for CBI producers to date. Petrojam Ethanol has been importing anhydrous ethanol since that time, which is sold to Petrojam. So essentially, we are not in a position to produce anhydrous ethanol here, and we are importing it.
Economically.
And it doesn't sound like that situation has changed at this point, or that there's any plan to start growing feedstock or producing feedstock here. I don't know. But there was a study done, $12 million study, which suggested that feedstock options were considered economical and suitable for local production. Okay. Yes, Mr. Yeah.
If my recollection is correct, when the 10% blend with ethanol started some time ago, was one of the consideration that it would be more economical to blend with the 10% in that the ethanol would have been produced here? Was that a consideration or other consideration like environmental or so?
Right, so the 10% ethanol, the 10% decision was based on two things. One was to replace the carcinogenic additive, MTBE first, and also 10% now we felt was introducible without any major infrastructure change to the pumping stations and so forth.
So going forward, there's no clear policy that has yet been determined as to what the future is for producing that 10% locally as opposed to importing it.
Sure, so that is why the new energy policy, the updated energy policy we're doing is very important, to look at the current landscape, look at opportunities before us going forward, and even to achieve 50% renewables or even greater percentages in time. So the new policy framework will help us to make that assessment and see also what exactly is involved in higher percentages of. If I might just add that when the 10% was introduced, the expectation was that would have moved from importing the energy ethanol to growing our local feedstock, and its backward linkages into community development and so forth. That never happened because of changes in the ownership structure of the sugar factories, etc., etc. However, the new policy will give us another look at this to see how best we can develop our local potential as part of developing our indigenous resources.
In that, Mr. Vidal, with the ownership structure in the sugar industry, which is where the Chinese had taken over much of the sugar factories with their company lands to support it. That now has changed dramatically in recent years with them having exited. So a lot of those sugar lands are now available for feedstock for other use and other alternative, because sugar cane is not the only feedstock. Sorghum, for example, I know there was a pilot project some time ago. Sorghum, yes. Are those still in the mix? And of course, I have to mention, with the departure of with the change in the ownership of the sugar industry, and those available lands include large tracts in Bernard Lodge, right, that revolve around the Bernard Lodge Sugar Factory, though that was closed and they went to Moneymus and Worthy Park. Bottom line, are we looking at integrating those sugarcane lands as sites for providing feedstock? And of course, you would like large, if that is the case, retaining existing agricultural lands like the Bernard Lodge lands would be a big boost or support base for growing the feedstock needed for any ethanol regeneration, so to speak, as part of the energy mix.
Well, basically, as we pointed to earlier in this report, that a study was done to assess the ability of the country to meet not only sugar targets, rum, and ethanol. And the study identified that we had enough agricultural land available. If it was put back into production, we could meet all three comfortable. And the importance of that is that while the rum market is what is drawing the current demand, just about for everything that is produced now, if we were to put back all available lands into production, we could meet all three targets. Again, that's just something that the new policy will have to consider seriously going forward.
Yeah. With the demise of the sugar industry, wonder where we're heading. So,
it is being planted.
all right, members, it's 4 minutes past 1. I think we can, unless anybody you wanted to.
This section, what we found, read the mechanisms and implement accountability mechanisms to ensure achieve the delegated functions. Now that the PCJ has been subsumed into the ministry itself, is being. So we can say then comfortably that these mechanisms of reporting and ensuring these delegated functions will be improved then.
That's the intent, sir.
All right. Thank you, PS. Thank you, Mr. Vidal. Thank you, other members of the team. Before I pack up, just completing the agenda. Any other business? No. Date of next meeting. We can meet on the 5th or the 12th of November. Both are available. So that would be a fortnight from now if we did the 5th, correct? So why don't we try for the 5th then? And we would be dealing with the Ministry of National Security, Performance Audit and Procurement Management at the Jamaica Constabulary Force. And that would be in a fortnight's time, which is the 5th of November. So, Madam Clerk, you will circulate that report to members as soon as possible. Thank you.
Just one last thing,
yes.
Chair. What percentage now, energy? You said that nationally we were looking at 20% renewable to electricity, or it's 30%?
To 2030. Through to 2030, 20% in energy mix overall, 30% of which would be electricity.
Electricity. Where are we now with the electricity?
It's about 17.5%.
Renewable to? in providing electricity.
Yes. So now the commissioning of the 37 megawatts 8 Rivers plant in Westmoreland recently would push us to an annual basis of 17.5%.
At what stage will we see cost reduction to the consumers in electricity when?
Well, the way to look at it, member, is that while we're not seeing major reductions now, we're also seeing almost a capping of the rate of rise. And the reason being that as more renewables get into the mix, then the level of vulnerability to external shocks or external pricing comes down. So for example, where we were at 95% petroleum at some point, any blip on the world market, 95% of the cost would have been impacted. Now we're about 85%, 85 to 87%. Only that percentage would have been reacting to increases on the world market. So we're not seeing full introduction or full reduction as yet, and particularly because renewables that we have introduced so far are intermittent sources, meaning that as the wind blows, as the sun shines, as the river runs, as we move into more contribution, and certainly where we can get some firm renewable energy capacity, that's when you're going to see the full replacement of the old inefficient plants. So for example, the 190 megawatt LNG fired plant is to be commissioned this month. It will see a major replacement of almost 150 megawatts of these 60-year-old plants, where you're getting a lot of the cost from. So once you start to replace those through the 190 megawatt, and by next year, second quarter, the 94 megawatts to Jamalco, by a new LNG fired plant, then you see the old plants leaving the system completely.
So you will see more efficiency.
You will start to see more efficiency and reductions.
Hopefully cost reduction.
Well, it will definitely be, because the LNG fuel is almost twice as efficient to give you the same power. And they will have low maintenance costs as well. So we will see the reduction.
And the OUR is regulated?
Yes, they're all regulated by the OUR.
All right. So, very well, thank you. Would anyone care to move for the adjournment? Moved by Member Phillips and seconded by Member Jackson. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Switch off.
Cool and me calm, stepping on the place like a lightning storm. Then up on the rhythm and I ring the alarm, so them coulda never try take the king for your man. Touch the stage anytime me perform, then best believe everything me go on. Then tell Babylon keep cool and keep calm, before them end up run up in a lightning storm. Forward a fi run when the general.
I me say PBCJ we cool and we calm. Step up in a yaso like a lightning storm. They up on the rhythm and a ring the alarm. Say them coulda never try take the king fin upon. In the studio, we a perform. Best believe everything we govern. Say go tell Babylon, keep cool and keep calm, before them go run up in a lightning storm. 5 stars say that, Rastafari.
Touch the stage anytime me perform, then best believe everything me govern. Then tell Babylon keep cool.
You'll always remember that day you became a parent. That day, you made yourself a promise to provide for them, to protect them, laugh with them,